and I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Carrie Curtis. She's a professor in transport planning at Curtin University and a member of the WA Planning Commission's Sustainable Transport Committee. She researches transport policy and integration, travel behavior, travel demand management, and land use. In her latest book, she examined how road-fixated policies stand in the way of genuinely sustainable transport systems. Please join me in welcoming Carrie.
Okay, this is a big challenge because the Avon lady will be calling me before I'm done, I know. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try and, the task I was set was to look at why it's so difficult to move away, so to try and understand what the barriers are to sustainable transport. A bit of a contrast to Peter's hope. I need to flag first what is sustainable transport, and for me it's not just about planning for public transport, it's planning for all modes of transport, but in this case the dominant mode is not the private car, hence the pyramid being inverted, that we need to plan in that order. We also need to integrate transport planning with land use planning. You can't have one without the other. We need to focus on the hardware, the infrastructure planning, but also the software, so the information, how legible we make our transport system and the city. And we need to think about people, so there's a whole strand in sustainable transport planning that's about behaviour change. And we need to look, as I do in my research, at from the city-wide level, right down to the unique qualities of, say, an individual street cross-section design. So it's quite a challenge, and it's not surprising then that it takes time and there are barriers when you're trying to capture all of these different aspects. I'm arguing tonight that delivering sustainable transport depends upon institutions and people. So I'm looking at some of the people in the room and saying, yep, that's you. So one of the issues we've got, one of the barriers, is that we've got a whole range of different professional groups: engineers, town planners, urban designers, transport planners. We've got politicians, we've also got the community. Not everybody is thinking in the same way. And when we look at the institutional side, we've got an array of different agencies trying to deliver transport. We've got, in this country, 3 tiers of government. We've got a whole set of rules and regulations associated with those agencies and those tiers. And I've put finance in there because I think that's one of the big babies that we need to think about. So institutions can clearly create barriers. And in our research, we try to focus on both the formal procedures and the informal procedures, the routines, the norms and the conventions that are embedded in those institutions, to try and understand what was going on. And we know very well in WA that institutions are not unchangeable or determined. We've seen quite significant change in the structuring at the state level. So they do change, but the question remains, how far can that change to the structure actually unlock barriers to sustainable transport? And that leads me then into thinking about the people in those institutions and the barriers they themselves create. So we need to focus on the mental models that people hold, the belief systems and the explanatory stories that they hold and use in decision making. So in our research, funded by the Australian federal government, we wanted to find out what was involved in bringing sustainability into influence in the planning and development of cities, where public policy is already organised around different rationales. So we looked at 3 cities, Sydney, Perth and Melbourne. We had 4 strands of inquiry. We looked at 50 years worth of transport policy in each of the cities. We looked at major infrastructure projects. We looked at institutional structure, and we also interviewed the people we thought of as the policy shapers over that 50-year period. What do we find out then, quickly? Barriers to change can be understood by examining the systems of finance and human resource in the different transport agencies. And what we found in all 3 cities is the public transport agency has been consistently weak. If you look at the technologies used by the different agencies, that also sheds some light on the barriers. So the conventional technologies of cost-benefit analysis or traditional transport modelling tend to serve objectives that aren't actually relevant to where we want to go in terms of sustainable transport. And Owen and I were having quite an interesting chat about that before we began. So one of the questions is, can we add new technologies that ask different questions to seek questions like who gets access and by what mode, not just simply how much travel time is saved if we build another road. So if we look at structural change, this is showing you the road sector in Sydney, Perth and Melbourne. What we've seen happening over time is a consolidation, so a collapsing down of a multiplicity of institutions into one. So the RTA in Sydney, roads in Melbourne, and interestingly in Perth it's main roads and it always has been. And that tells you something about continuity of ideas and the ability to move road sector policy forward. If you compare it in the public transport sector, what we've seen, and I'm only showing you Sydney and Melbourne here, is fragmentation of agencies and also privatisation. And that's served to weaken the agencies, and there's been a lack of continuity. Moving on to policy then, well, there is no one transport policy document. There's a whole range of influences in each city. And when we looked at policy, we didn't just look at land use policy or transport policy or public transport policy hardly existed. We also looked at annual reports to try and get a sense of the direction. So one barrier obviously is if there's a whole range of policy influences and there are a range of different agencies and professional groups, they're clearly not singing off the same song sheet. So there's going to be all sorts of issues with communication. We used a device called a storyline to try and examine the talk that goes around policy. So a storyline is the discourse, the explanation and justification for policy. It's sometimes written, it's more often verbal. The latest one that I remembered is that we have to keep building roads to keep freight moving. That's the kind of idea of a storyline. And what we found is that each professional group had its own set of storylines that it used to continue us moving in a direction we didn't necessarily want to be going in. So they use quite powerfully to block change. So some examples here for Perth. I'll just let you read them while I read. So in Perth, predict and provide is one of the storylines. In the Seeds and Hepburn Plan of 1955, an increase in the volume of traffic cannot be escaped. Without early provision for it, the chaos and congestion of the city's roads and streets in the near future may be beyond rectification. Quite emotive language in these policies. In 1990, in Metro Plan, we're still predict and providing. The road network is a vital concern to future development. And then the other interesting storyline, low urban density can only be served by roads. Well, I think we've proved that even with low urban density cities like Perth, you can still see public transport happening and being effective to some extent. Ah, there's Avon. The difference, I'm not going to get through it. The difference in the public transport policy is a set of storylines that actually serve to block public transport provision. So constantly over the years you read about the public transport deficit, the fact that we're subsidising it. We saw it again in the last state election. That fixed rail is obsolete. That if you build public transport, it's really about providing a welfare solution for people who can't afford cars. So there was a sense of inevitability. That people prefer to drive in Perth. We should just accept that. Public transport will never be appealing to tourist travellers. We tried to compare these storylines in the different cities over time. So this is looking at Melbourne from 1954 to the turn of the century. The green is the sustainability storyline. What's quite interesting here is it clearly features in policy. So from the 1970s, we see evidence of the sustainability storyline. But the predict and provide, chronic congestion, those sorts of storylines pervade sustained all the way through, and it's the same in all three cities. So what happens when positive policy is written? I remember arriving here a long time ago now, balanced transport. I thought, oh great, you're talking the right language. For me, balanced transport meant equal balance between the different modes. But my experience was in action. What happened is we were redesigning the road, we weighed up all the modes, but we didn't have room for the on-road bike lane, we didn't have room for the separate bus lane, because we needed a right turn lane, a left turn lane, parking lanes, and room for through traffic. So balance for some just means weighing it up and then chucking everything else out. Where positive policy does occur, what was really exciting in the Melbourne sense was the 1988 Met Plan. Finally, we moved away from the public transport deficit to a city that said it wanted a world-class public transport system, but bad timing. At the same time, there was major structural reform in the public transport agencies. They removed all the conductors off trams, they removed all the ticket offices. It was a complete disaster, going in the wrong direction. I'm going to skirt over that. I know I don't have time, but we did look at lobby groups and what happened. We interviewed the policy shapers. So I'm showing you here what happened to the engineer's tale. I can tell you that balanced transport, predict and provide, missing links, so we need to keep building a road to join the dots between one place and the next. That we have to continue with free movement by car. That safety means we need to build more roads or widen them. There's still storylines evident today. The sustainability tale does gain some traction. We heard from our policy shapers that they understood what demand management meant, that travel itself could be a cost, and a little glimmer that there might even be a roads deficit to talk about instead of a public transport deficit. But what we found then is certainly what we've read in the policy documents correlated with what policy shapers thought. It was clearly aligned to the different professional groups, and how policy shapers think determines how they act. The old paradigm of transport planning still holds sway, and where the sustainability tale was strong, it wasn't particularly consistent. And when it came to operationalising it, so what does land use transport integration mean, it clearly needed to be spelt out if it was to avoid the subversion of something like balanced transport. And I'm going to finish by trying to sell my book. I might need to live on the royalties. If you go onto the Ashgate website, you can get 10% off, and you'll need it because it's English price, it's hardback, and they don't publish the paperback version until they've sold enough of the hardback. And this is how you can get hold of me for more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.